getaway car and he was killed. And the person who killed him was not held responsible.
Appeared to be on drugs. They'll say that this was about race, which is absolutely ridiculous. I didn't see a black man threatening passengers. I saw a man threatening passengers.
I'm not afraid of him. He just doesn't look like the type to kill somebody. You try to imagine yourself in his place and to see how he's feeling, looking at the pillows with blood stains and everything, if he really did it or not.
He was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope, and yesterday was a really bad day for him.
March 14, 1997 marks the day that the world would change forever. A baby was born in Columbus, Ohio, who would go on to be so remarkable that the world would never be the same. But given this gal's beginning, nobody would have guessed where her story was going. While many of her future colleagues were groomed for success from the onset, this child's spawn point was being camped by snipers of oppression. Her parents struggled with addiction, and she ended up in foster care for a while before her grandfather took her and her siblings in. But when he started spending more time with her, he began to notice that she wasn't like other children. She was exceptional. Even as a child, she never stopped moving, always running and jumping and being as active as she could be. She would go out of her way to attempt physically daring stunts most folks wouldn't dream of trying, and she'd actually manage to pull them off. One day on a field trip when she was 6, her teacher noticed her imitating some teens practicing gymnastic tricks, and she was doing them successfully. That's when her family put her in gymnastic classes and her world changed forever. Because that brave, talented little girl with the odds stacked fairly high against her went on to be Simone Biles, one of the most decorated gymnasts ever, with 11 Olympic medals to her name. Her story is inspiring, impressive, it makes you feel good. But as much as she was out here winning with the world watching and applauding, Simone was struggling behind closed doors. And she was struggling with something that nobody wanted to talk about, especially we people who are darker than blue. As a child, she was diagnosed with ADHD and had been coping with that while becoming an athletic superstar. Not to mention that Simone was carrying a ridiculous amount of pressure on her shoulders, and it was affecting her mental health in ways that you could not imagine. She started experiencing intense anxiety and panic attacks. She was afraid to do tricks she had mastered years before, and was experiencing something that gymnasts call the twisties. That's when they start overthinking performances and start to lose control of their body, which is a huge problem for someone who is doing super dangerous tricks on a daily basis. This all culminated in 2020 when Simone made the call to pull out of the Tokyo Olympics.
The greatest gymnast in history has pulled out of the team competition at the Tokyo Olympics after stumbling during her vault routine.
Everyone was convinced that Simone was going to kill it at these games. But she wasn't her usual self. She told the public that she freaked out in a high-stress situation. And I quote, "I don't know if it's age and I'm feeling a little bit more nervous when I do gymnastics. I feel like I'm also not having as much fun. This Olympic Games, I wanted it to be for myself. But I came in and I felt like I was still doing it for other people. It hurts my heart that doing what I love has been kind of taken away from me to please other people." And while some people were praising her for putting herself first, the majority of the public wasn't into it. How dare she stop performing in the way they wanted to because of something like mental health? She was lucky to even be up there, and now she was throwing it all away because she was nervous. Publications were calling her a quitter and saying she abandoned her team when they needed her the most. Yeah, because I'm sure you know a lot about what it takes to be an Olympic gold medalist pair smoking. Now, as we all know, Simone worked on her mental health and came back the next Olympics practically doing a clean sweep of the awards. And surprise, surprise, everyone loved her once again. Unfortunately, this story is all too common. We could go on about the misogynoir, socioeconomic challenges, and all that comes with being a generational athlete. But black women like Simone have mastered the art of achievement. They've had to fight twice as hard to get half as much as their white peers. And many of them have used that determination to accomplish things that we didn't even think were possible. But the moment that they're human, and they get vulnerable with something like mental health, the world turns against them. I can't help but liken the backlash to Simone seeking some time to focus on her own health, to the same way that some audiences jeer at black athletes when they get political.
Once they run their mouths like that, unfortunately, a lot of kids and some adults take these ignorant comments seriously. Look, there might be a cautionary lesson in LeBron for kids. This is what happens when you attempt to leave high school a year early to join the NBA. And it's always unwise to seek political advice from someone who gets paid $100 million a year to bounce a ball. Oh, and LeBron and Kevin, you're great players, but no one voted for you. Millions elected Trump to be their coach. So keep the political commentary to yourself, or as someone once said, shut up and dribble.
These comments are verbal whips in the neo-plantation of black athleticism because anything that interrupts the audience's enjoyment and delectation is seen as an inconvenience, that it's far too close to home and near the bone. Black people aren't allowed to experience these things or take time to work on themselves. Even if you're a world record-holding badass who's done nothing but win your entire life, they're still quick to call you a quitter the moment you need a breather.
You're not treated with a soft glove like white people typically are.
Mental health isn't a good enough reason for black folks to top off beat. Yet, when a white person does the same thing, or something more heinous actually, it can be used as their get-out-of-jail-free card. Don't get my blood boiling about the MAP 6'9" God child enthusiast that the Plan B spared, cause y'all ain't had nothing to say about him being in the Olympics. But of course that was because he's a white Dutch guy, so what do you think the reaction was? Cause if you guessed nowhere near as hostile as people were towards Simone Biles for protecting herself, then you would be correct.
Hi, I wanted to speak in defense of the Dutch guy. I mean, you know, my first reaction is, what right do we have to criticise the Dutch justice system?
It's the British justice system, John.
Sorry?
He was convicted in Britain, John.
Well, okay, forgive me. What right do we have to assume that our system does not take atonement into account? You know, are we saying that people should pay and pay and pay indefinitely? That doesn't sound like a very Christian attitude to me, you know. And taking into account the age of adulthood is 18, right? Supposedly, but that's not a finite number. You know, there's a range of abilities and understanding.
No, John, no, sir. No, and no again.
You have the same energy as people who were clamoring about Aman Khalif being trans when she wasn't even trans to begin with. It's really wild when you think about it. I mean, this woman spent her entire life achieving feats that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. I could barely wash my own blood clot bark because I too jacked. Nah, that's cap, I ain't gonna lie. It's because my body's stiffer than my at sunrise. But what am I even saying? She was thrusted into the spotlight, made to be a public figure, and had more stress on her shoulders than the average human could even handle, all before she could legally have a drink, and she could definitely use one at that point. And yet no one could give her a little grace when she had to work on her own mental health. But the white guy who assaulted people has defenders calling into his show on his behalf. Simone Biles is just one of the many exceptional black people who are celebrated for their accomplishments, but their mental health struggles are ignored or even criticized. And that very black exceptionalism, as we will soon see, is a double-edged sword. Janelle Monáe is one of the most innovative artists in the game right now. And just like Simone, they winning awards left, right, and center for their craft. 10 Grammy nominations, 66 wins in some other categories, but they've also grappled with being neurodivergent and have needed a lot of therapy to help them work through these issues. Janelle recognizes that having access to these things is unfortunately a privilege, saying, and I quote, "Not a lot of people have the luxury of saying or doing what it is I'm doing. I think that therapy, life coaching included, should be free for every American. There's so many people walking around wounded emotionally. We would be better as a country, as a planet, if everybody had the access." Or how about Sha'Carri Richardson? You know, people love their energy, charisma, and of course talent. They were all about her when she was breaking records in track, But when her ma passed away in 2021, she understandably had a very difficult time. I think that you would understand, but some people don't. You can literally feel her heartbreak in these interviews.
Going from just last week, losing my biological mother, and I'm still here.
What did you say? You lost your mother?
Yeah, I'm still here. Last week, finding out my biological mother passed away, and still choosing to pursue my dreams, still coming out here, still making sure to make the family that I do still have on this earth proud, and the fact that nobody knows what I go through.
So she ended up smoking some green to deal with the massive trauma. And what did that get her? The Olympics immediately kicked out, just like Jazz out of Uncle Phil house. Just as quickly as the world supported her when she was winning, the public turned on her the moment she didn't live up to their expectations. And despite the fact that the stuff was legal in half of the states in the US, and that Sha'Carri was dealing with an excruciating heartbreak of losing a parent, she was villainized. People called her unprofessional and thought she didn't deserve to run anymore. And spoiler alert, she came back even better.
And I'm ready, mentally, physically, and emotionally. Yeah. And I'm here to stay. I'm not back, I'm better.
The mental health of the marginalized and the response we get when we try to improve it is completely different than non-people of color. And it all goes back to the capitalist structure of valuing black folks as assets rather than human beings. Impressive women like Simone Biles, Sha'Carri Richardson, and Janelle Monáe are celebrated when they're winning, but just as quickly discarded to the side when they struggle.
I grew up as one of the gifted and talented kids. I was definitely burning out a ton. I was getting behind in my classes, and so I started going to therapy. She was the one who clocked it. So I come into therapy and I come in with a Monster energy drink. And she was like, "Oh, I've never seen you with one of those." And I was like, "Yeah, I drink 4 or 5 of them a day." And she's like, "Sorry?" I get up in the morning at 5:30, pre-workout. I go to CrossFit. Had to be at my med school classes by 8:40. When I got to those classes, I would have probably another cup of coffee. There was a break in the middle. So then I'd go get a Monster from the vending machine. Then I'd go to lunch, probably have more coffee or a Monster. If I had coffee at lunch, I'd have a Monster in the afternoon. If I had Monster at lunch, then I'd do coffee in the afternoon. Then I'd get home, and depending on how much work I had to do, I might have another scoop of pre-workout or a coffee. And so she was like, "That's 1.2 grams of caffeine a day." And I was like, "Sure, I'm not counting it." She basically goes into her office or into her desk and rifles through some papers and pulls out a sheet, and she's like, "Can you fill this out?" And it was the ADHD evaluation sheet. Never had thought about that being something that I'd have. And then because of all the relying on external validation stuff, it's would I have seen that and then been "Oh, but that can't be me."
It's just another example of racial disparities that still permeate our culture. When a black individual struggles with their mental health, they're demonized. They're called weak, lazy, dangerous, and ostracized for not performing well enough. Yet, mental health is constantly used as a defense for white people time and time again.
Yeah, take a look at this report. It goes in depth into Adam Lanza's mental health, though when they refer to him inside the report, they only refer to him as, quote, the shooter this, the shooter had that. And as you take a look in here and start turning the pages, especially when you start getting to page 32, 33, 34, inside this document, it starts to paint a picture of a very disturbed man.
And these kinds of issues of getting them care. For example, when parents are required to get their kids treatment, the same parents who are required are also not allowed to have the information about what their kids need or if they've gone off their meds or stopped their treatment. And so the same people who are required to make sure their children get help are also not given really the authority or the information very often that they need in order to make sure that help happens. And then later on, they become the objects of blame when something really terrible happens. So we need to find a better way to communicate.
10 years ago, on July 20th, 2012, 12 people lost their lives and dozens more were injured at a midnight showing of Batman: The Dark Knight Rises when James Holmes opened fire in an Aurora, Colorado movie theater. Holmes was ultimately sentenced to 12 life sentences plus an extra 3,000 years in prison for the mass murder. Before the massacre, psychiatrist Dr. Lynn Fenton spent months providing mental health care to Holmes, and after she spent years questioning whether she could have done something to stop the Aurora theater shooting from happening at all.
What if I told you that that's just the surface of a much larger subject that is tabooed for my hue? Beyond that, this is personal. I've never talked about my own mental health till today. And I'm going to tell you exactly how this imbalance started. how it affects us every day, and maybe, just maybe, how we could progress to a better future. What is your experience with neurodivergence?
This is me being very transparent about my story.
My experience with neurodivergence is the same as a lot of little black boys in cities, and that is, ain't nothing wrong with him. You either touched in the head or ain't nothing wrong with him.
Raising my hand in class was the thing that I always think of. It seemed like everyone else could figure out that logical break of like the person has stopped talking or whatever, and so you can raise your hand because it makes sense to raise your hand now. Whereas I was always looking around like, I have a question, but like, I don't know how you find that time. I don't understand how everyone else seems to be able to figure out when that is either.
Ain't nothing wrong with this boy, he just need discipline. Ain't nothing wrong with this boy, he just need a little structure, you know what I mean?
My first grown-up therapist, I would say, diagnosed me with PTSD. I had lead paint poisoning. I'm from Baltimore. Baltimore is like very known for that, especially back from when I was born. But I had lead paint poisoning. All of my siblings had it because of the way that was structured. When I was a baby, I was exposed to lead paint poisoning, as were all my siblings. And I know people make a lot of jokes about people with lead paint poisoning and stuff. A lot of people in Baltimore specifically have lead paint poisoning. It was like a whole thing. Hopkins was sued for intentionally moving families into units and housing to experiment on. This is a very long and complex history.
Because these are things that are usually diagnosed in childhood, a lot of practitioners are kind of like, well, you didn't get a diagnosis as a child, so you can't have as an adult. And so I wanted to avoid that. So I started looking into places that did adult diagnoses. They tend to be very expensive if you're paying out of pocket, and a lot of insurance doesn't cover it. So I believe out of pocket, it would have been about a little under $4,000. Got the diagnosis level on.
If you're leaning more onto the learning disability side, once you get into Down syndrome or more, I don't want to say severe cases of autism, they'll say you touched in the head.
Growing up, I was tested for ADHD, so I have ADHD. People who have lead paint poisoning are more susceptible to things like ADHD and things along those lines.
I know my parents has watched my videos, but I can need you all to log off just for a little bit, because I sharing some childhood trauma here because I can't afford therapy. They going? Alright, so let me tell you about how my audience diagnosed me with something I probably should have been diagnosed with as a child, but I couldn't, because Afro-Caribbean parents. Be me, hair tough and coil up like Brillo pad, and my knees got more ash on them than my dad, Uncle Ern. I sitting in my head mistress office for the umpteenth time for being the class clown. And you know what, Miss Morse? I did end up amounting to something. I make people laugh and learn for a living. You, however, you ain't living because you looking up at me from down below. But I digress. This visit wasn't like the other ones because this was an intervention. This was a coordinated attack. This was a conspiracy. Miss Morse, or the real Plock Boy Morse, as I affectionately refer to her as, because she must see is brush her teeth with a toilet wand for a toothbrush and use onion powder as toothpaste. Rest her soul. She hailed from Turf Island, or as you might know it as the United Kingdom. Miss Morse could say, I rung your mum and the guidance counselor to discuss something of the utmost importance. You could have started a fire from my ashy knees, trembling together like leaves to fall in the fall. I anticipating a biblical beating that my ma about to bestow upon my backside when she get in here. I probably repressed everything between when Miss Morse told me that she was coming and when she actually came. Because all I remember is the look on her face when the guidance counselor said that he would like to test me for ADHD. My ma yanked me by my little ears. I ain't got much, but she yanked me out of that office. And she was clamoring that ain't nothing wrong with her good child, her one good child, and that I ain't got nothing. Fast forward to today, where every video essay I make has ADHD tangents scribbled throughout the proverbial margins of these videos. The question of my ADHD comes up, and my lovely community of big and be them big woman them and big man them, you all diagnosed me with ADHD. almost assuming that I already knew. I remember reflecting on how my life would have been different had Black Boy Moss been successful with diagnosing me at the tender age of 10. As much as I loathed her, she was trying to help. Maybe, I got some controversial thoughts on medical capitalism, so stay tuned. But speaking of ADHD, I get off topic. What if I told you that this goes far deeper than the diagnosis and Adderall shortages? What if I told you that this distrust of Big Pharma, the rise in TikTok diagnosis and medical conspiracies that make Alex Jones himself blush? What if I told you that there's a warranted reason for all of it? Well, in order to get there, you must start at the start. This trend of condemning Black people for their mental health goes way back. I'm talking, it's coming. I'm talking about way back to slavery. I'm sorry, I gotta talk about it. I'm sorry. Back in the 18th century, they used to say that Black people were immune to mental illness. A medical director from Virginia named John Galt suggested that slaves couldn't possibly be at risk for mental illness because they don't own property, participate in the economy, vote, or hold office. He thought that only white slave owners could experience mental health struggles because they're the ones who had to deal with the stress of making profit. It definitely sounded like they was dealing with something, but I think Mr. Galt and I might have a different diagnosis for these poor, burdened slave owners.
Their idea was that African Americans had a less developed nature, were intended to be servants to white people. And so their idea was that slavery was the natural state for Africans who needed to be guided and led by Europeans for their own health.
You see, mental health, like many other things back then, was just another tool used to dehumanize and other Black folks. After all, mental well-being is a distinctly human thing. And saying that it was something that couldn't affect Black people was a not so covert way of making them seem like less than human. Like they weren't capable of complexities that made them thinking, breathing, feeling humans. Because slaves were akin to livestock to these people, and you wouldn't be worrying about taking your animals to therapy, right? Eventually, psychiatrists started using the concept of mental health as a way to pathologize normal behavior and control the Black community even further. For instance, in 1851, a guy named Samuel Cartwright published a report that said enslaved people's urge to run away or resist their captures was actually a mental illness. But you all bitten on the insane root date, because that sounds like the most rational thing I've read in this entire research. Once slavery was abolished, in 1865, the narrative quickly went from Black people can't be mentally ill to mentally ill Black people are a danger to society.
Black insanity was often associated with criminality. It was thought to be especially deviant than insanity among whites. And so that very much shaped how people of African descent were treated, were managed in asylums.
All of a sudden, being Black and struggling with your mental health made you pretty much a criminal. So the United States decided it was high time to open up a psychiatric facility for slaves that had been newly freed. They swap our chains for chains. Because you already know that this facility wasn't about helping anyone, rather than containing and restraining them.
They had no medication for mentally ill people. Electroshock was the order of the day. Lobotomies, they did lobotomies at Central State.
Mental health facilities back in the day were harrowing and gruesome for just about anyone. But the conditions for Black people were even more horrifying. There weren't any genuine attempts at therapeutic treatment going on at these places. They were usually kept in disgusting spaces, and their treatment involved putting them to work in fields, the kitchen, and doing laundry. So basically, what you're telling me is that they finally created this institution to help freed slaves, and the place was actually just a low-key way to put them back into forced labor? I got you. Sounds about right. When they weren't exacerbating their mental health struggles, doctors and scientists were using Black people as guinea pigs to further medical research. Yes, we are going to do inhumane things to these humans for science. Like in 1932, the Tuskegee experiment. They took 600 Black men from Alabama, and they told them that they were receiving treatment for bad blood. What the hell is bad blood? I look like Taylor Swift? Sorry, I need to, be charitable about my take here. What noble, Hippocratic oath taking and big heart having people out of the kindness of their soul helping these ashy Black folks. Come on, I can't even lie to you. They were straight up lying to participants' faces and secretly watching the long-term effects of untreated syphilis on the body instead of what they claimed that they were doing.
But their recruitment plan centered on a lie. While the researchers planned to observe how syphilis would progress with minimal treatment, participants were told they would receive free drugs and care for their condition. At first, researchers gave the men existing treatments, but these were soon replaced with placebos. Under the false pretense of providing a special remedy, researchers performed painful and invasive spinal taps to investigate the disease's neurological consequences. When patients died, the PHS would swoop in to study the body by funding funerals in exchange for autopsies. In their published studies, they listed the men as volunteers to obscure the circumstances under which they'd been recruited.
These participants weren't getting any treatment at all. In fact, even when penicillin was discovered as the cure for the disease, the doctors didn't give it to these men because they wanted to carry on their little experiment. They were just like, look, you getting in the way of progress. As many as 100 men died in the name of their unnecessary, cruel, and shiftless excuse for a study. And way more suffered in incomprehensible ways. I can't even talk about it because TOS. It wasn't until the 1960s that the nightmarish, segregated mental hospitals were changed. And it took another decade before the 40-year Tuskegee experiment finally ended. But the damage was already done. After literal centuries of not just neglecting Black people's mental health, but weaponizing it against them, using it as a way to invalidate their experiences or behavior, and continue to maintain control, it literally changed the culture of Black Americans and the greater Black diaspora around mental health. It showed them that they could clearly not trust American medicine at all. I mean, would you trust an institution that, not fee for three, would you trust an institution that thought you weren't human enough to have mental health struggles? Then used your psychology as a way to make you seem like a criminal and imprison you further. And then even began doing deadly experiments on the people in your community. Hell flicking no, I didn't think so. Them going to hell on a gas truck. And it wasn't just a distrust. I mean, what's that theory that basically says don't assign malice to things that could be explained by ignorance. I forget who said that, but maybe it was just ignorance on the part of Western medicine. Because you literally didn't have the literature to support any of the research to essentially know what to do when you see someone with melanin for the first time. Because the vast majority of clinical trials and research into medical conditions are conducted on white men. A particular type of white men, by the way. Fat folks, women bodies, y'all ain't spared neither, so calm it down.
A recent review of government-funded cancer research studies found that all racial and ethnic minorities were considerably underrepresented. It also found that fewer than 2% of these clinical trials focus specifically on the needs of minorities.
The lack of diversity has led to bad science. I think that the field is biased. I think that there's institutional discrimination and biases, racism, that are ever present in the field. I respect science, but I think that we have significant hurdles to overcome.
Because it's obvious from the beginning who they really cared about helping, who they really cared about curing, whose health they're really concerned about. And you could bet that they're still running safe, ethical experiments when it's white people involved. Don't you? I could bet you your bottom dollar that there ain't no Adam Smith out here. Sorry, man, I need to put on some shoes. Trust me, the white folks, they getting the fair and free experiments and randomized controlled trials to make sure that their health is prioritized. But me? No. They could tell me that I got heart disease in my family and I could dead. This toxic history created a medical and mental health system that's still infested with systematic disparities between minorities and white people to this day. And it's even worse than it appears on the surface. The damaging stereotypes and treatment of black folks' mental health has been completely baked into the modern healthcare system. Even centuries later, those stances that were used to justify slavery a couple thousand years ago are the origin point, the spawn point of so many disparities in psychiatry today.
You said the following, and I quote, "We should not be giving black people the same vaccine schedule that's given to whites because their immune system is better than ours." Can you please explain what you meant?
There's a series of studies, I think most of them by Poland, that show that to particular antigens that blacks have a much stronger reaction. There's differences in reaction to different products by different races.
So I have 17 seconds left. Let me just ask you then. So what different vaccine schedule would you say I should have received? What different vaccine schedule should I have received?
I mean, the Poland article suggests...
To the point where mental health for black versus white folks are two completely different things. Let's start with the basics, access. Let's say that you're going through a tough time, you know? You're feeling unbearably anxious or depressed, or you simply don't feel like your usual self. Eventually it gets so bad that you decide something has to change, you know? You need help. You start looking around for a mental health professional to provide some relief for yourself. You're looking, until you're disheartened to realize that there aren't any facilities anywhere near you. Or if on the off chance there are, they don't take your insurance, and it would cost you a whole salary to pay for it out of pocket. You effectively have nowhere to turn. This is the experience that so many minorities face when they're trying to get mental health care. If they do get in the door of some clinic, they are typically subjected to a far longer wait time and much lower quality of care. Oftentimes, the only way that they are even able to get any sort of help is when things get so severe that they have to turn to emergency services, who aren't as equipped as they should be to handle things like mental health situations. Even when there is a mental health counselor or a therapist accessible, they usually don't have cultural insight to understand or necessarily help the black community, because 88% of mental health professionals in the United States are, you guessed it, white. At their best, these professionals aren't qualified to deal with the needs of the black community, and at their worst, they're actively prejudiced. Now, there's still that, 12%, right? But they're spread across the entire, continental USA, making it that much harder when it comes to someone who's already going through a tough time, as they're actively searching for a therapist.
And it isn't even about race. You just have to be culturally competent. If you don't know my struggle and I come in full of rage, black people have a lot to be angry about. Have you taken a history class? You know what I mean? And so a lot of times we get misdiagnosed because people are culturally incompetent, and you want to give me a pill for my rage. I don't need a pill. I need you to hear me, and I need you to give me active exercises to do to get me out of my head when I go into this space.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that a black person can't have a white therapist. That's not it. What I'm saying is that white mental health professionals shouldn't be the only option out there, but they usually are. Especially when working with a mental health professional who actually gets your background, that could make the world of a difference.
For the first time ever, all of my therapists, all of my mental health professionals are black. That makes a really, really big difference, because cultural context comes into play with everybody. A lot of what we know about mental health and a lot of how traditional therapy is structured ignores the experiences of people of color, the intersectional experiences of people of color. Cultural competency, as I found out, is not something that is taught.
She decided to seek help specifically from a black male therapist.
Black men handle emotions differently, and I wanted someone who could understand how Noah was feeling and help him navigate through that.
A kid
or a client, right? They don't care what you know until they know that you care.
Once you switch it to a black person with no black people around them and no black communication channels, all hell broke loose, bro.
I had this one colleague who is a clinician, and they were telling me the story about a young black girl who was getting mental health help from a white doctor. And while she was being evaluated, the doctor noticed her repeatedly tapping on her head and ended up marking it down as self-harm behavior. The truth is, as you know, many black women inside my audience probably already know, that her head was itching because she was tapping the spots around her braids to relieve it without messing up her hair. You know, this is something that might seem, common sense to some people who are in community with people with other hair textures, but this is something that a practitioner who actually understood her background would have gotten immediately. But because her clinician was white and didn't understand it, the woman then had to go on and explain to multiple health care providers that no, she's not interested in self-harming. All that time could have been used to work through her real issues, but instead it was wasted on her having to defend her own cultural difference, which yet again reminds me that we are always supposed to be these big advocates, authorities, and we have to be able to go and write dissertations on our own lived experience just to defend it to someone who does not know a day inside our own shoes. All to be billed at the end of the day for a session that brought you no closer to any resolve. This is the sort of thing that leads to us just steering clear of therapy altogether. At that rate, what's even the point?
Black therapists overall get treated as incompetent. We want Black therapists, right? But we don't want Black therapists who still act like they're Black people. We don't want Black therapists to use AAVE. We don't want us to show up in a way that is anything but white. I have people who see me and don't believe that I'm capable of this job. Like, I wear do-rags a lot. I've had people who have never had me as a therapist say like, wow, this therapist is everywhere but with their clients, because they don't see me, a therapist, with my clients as if like I'm supposed to broadcast my sessions on the internet.
But all right, charitable again. For argument's sake, let's say that you get past all that, find a therapist who we've already discussed is most likely to be white, and you go in for another session. Then you get to our next issue, misdiagnosis. You see, the mental health world is sloppy when it comes to Black folks. We are way more likely to be misdiagnosed if we turn to a mental health professional. I talking ethnic minorities are up to 30% more likely.
I absolutely think there's like a lot of important things you're highlighting right now. Working in foster care and seeing like Black children be labeled as having aggressive behavior. There's disorders where Black children are more likely to be diagnosed if they have disruptive behaviors. And this like typically leads to like a future of carcerality where these children are criminalized, especially because they have on their record these disorders. A lot of the times when children are displaying disruptive behaviors, there is a need that's not being met, but it's like so much easier to slap a diagnosis on it.
I, for one, this might be a little tinfoil hatty, but I, for one, don't think that's a coinky-dink. No. And often the conditions that we're misdiagnosed with are really serious as well, like schizophrenia. You heard it here, folks. Black folks in particular are 2.4 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia specifically. This is one of those things where cultural insight comes into play. A big part of the criteria for having schizophrenia is paranoia and mistrust. People with schizophrenia will often think that they're being targeted or experience a fear of being followed or watched. But the thing is, Black folks in particular have a valid reason for feeling these type of ways, and it doesn't mean that we're schizophrenic. When you take into consideration history and the world of discrimination that still very much exists, it makes total sense why we might not be as trusting.
I was always taught to be strong in this world. Told to never let my guard down because at any moment I could be attacked without a moment's notice. That my skin made me a target. Skin that has persevered through many trials and tribulations, from seeing my mama raped by landlords, to my father being beaten and stripped of his manhood, to my brothers and sisters being separated into jobs for this bigger system. My skin.
Conveniently, schizophrenia has also been traditionally stigmatized as a dangerous mental illness, despite the fact that most people who actually have the disorder have never actually committed a violent crime in their life.
We developed at that time a belief that schizophrenia was an illness that was increasingly marked by anger, hostility, projection. And even though that's not part of the diagnosis anymore, you see the origin in the 1960s of a set of stigmatizations of people with schizophrenia in particular as being violent that rose throughout the latter half of the 20th century, even after they were associated with race. All of a sudden, initially this was a category that was applied to these angry, protesting African-American men.
I used to work in a lockdown facility for boys. And in that facility, it was for boys who had a history of violent charges. A lot of these boys, like if you ask me, were very much so neurodivergent. They just happened to also experience poverty, and that contributed to them acting out those behaviors, immediately being met with criminality. They are literally incarcerated like teenagers. The treatment, I would say, was a mental health facility, but the reality is those resources, when couched in the system, they don't really put as much energy into actual rehabilitation and psychoeducation and mental health care than they do things like carcerality, like actually locking like these boys up.
So you got this mental health illness that is being thrown on every Black person who walks in the door, and it just so happens to be the one that's unfairly labeled as violent and dangerous. It happens with kids too. Black children are more likely to be diagnosed with extreme disruptive disorders, like oppositional defiant disorder, whereas white kids are usually diagnosed with much less serious and less stigmatized ADHD. One doctor explained the seriousness of this by stating that, and I quote, "When you give a Black child a diagnosis like oppositional defiant disorder, you're branding them as a bad kid, not just to schools and their peers, but also within the medical field."
A kid could be having a mental episode and they are like put in a chokehold or like restrained and like put in isolation, versus say a white person, like when they're like having a mental break or when they're like expressing themselves in a way like that, they aren't typically met with like, wow, this person is a criminal. It's more like this person is mentally unwell. They're humanized a lot more than what we are.
Even when a Black child is diagnosed with something more common like ADHD, they're treated completely differently.
Most of my friends who are neurodivergent, they got childhood diagnoses. And for ADHD, there's like inattentive and hyperactive or whatever it is, the two kind of sides of the coin. I lean inattentive. I think a lot of them probably either were combined or leaned a little bit hyperactive. In the research, it's a known thing that like inattentive tends to be underdiagnosed because it doesn't present outwardly quite as much. It's not also the stereotype of like a young boy who can't like sit in his chair. That's, I think, usually what people think about when they think about ADHD. Even for women who might lean hyperactive, you're kind of conditioned in childhood to rein that back in, which I think is also why things like eating disorders, substance use is pretty common in the neurodivergent community.
It used to force me to look him into the eye because, you know, we have problems maintaining eye contact. And to this day, I have to count to make sure I'm making a precise amount of eye contact when I'm talking to someone. Like, it's something I still don't understand. You just have to learn how to mask it to adapt.
A woman by the name of Alyssa Tandaro explained how it felt to grow up as a Black woman with ADHD, stating, and I quote, that many of my teachers made no attempts to hide their biases and often saw me as an impulsive, misbehaving student rather than one struggling with symptoms of a condition. Day in and day out, I wasn't given the space to fully explore my identity and understand myself, ADHD and all. Instead, society dished out shame, accused me of being lazy, and provided no support for a neurodivergent mind like mine.
You just learn to kind of like shove it inside and do your best to fit into whatever mold you're supposed to be in. And then I think that that particularly applies to non-white people, where as a woman, I'm already expected to like be a certain way. And then like as a Black person, it's like, okay, like you really can't be making a scene.
And the ADHD diagnosis came out around high school. And that one was an easier one because it's something they can visibly see. You're hyperactive, you're not paying attention. But even then, when you're a little Black boy, it's always behavior-based. I was suspended freshman and sophomore year of high school. I was suspended a total of 13 times. 13 times. That's more in my entire scholastic career.
And while they out here overdiagnosing Black people with all these serious conditions, they're simultaneously underdiagnosing them with conditions they actually need treatment for. I can't make this up. Like, for instance, depression, PTSD, or another mood disorder that can cause immense amount of suffering. These types of medical prejudices have created a landscape in which Black people's mental health is criminalized rather than treated. I mean, after all, Black people are like 57% more likely to be 5150'd or put on a involuntary mental health hold in the United States. That feels a lot less like helping and more like control.
Black people are treated so punitively when it comes to like neurodivergence. It always comes with this like criminality where you are immediately assumed to be a suspect. Black people don't have access to resources in the same way. So I think like we either have to learn how to mask super well or we crash and burn a lot of the times. And we are called every stereotype in the book if we do. When it comes to like substance use disorder, right? When it's crack, it's criminal. When it's opioids, it's an epidemic.
I was in a conversation just trying to express myself, and I might go like this, like, okay, you're missing my point. And someone would go, okay, well now I think I need security in here because you're being confrontation. I was like...
One study found that between Black and white Americans with the same mental health challenges, substance abuse, and income, Black people were much more likely to be arrested. In a mental health crisis, white people are typically treated with empathy, brought in peacefully, and given treatment. Yet that same exact situation for a Black person results in prison, or even worse. And we've seen this horrifying contrast play out time and time again. December 14, 2012. Newport, Connecticut. Children at Sandy Hook Elementary are on a final stretch before school lets out for their winter break. It was like any other peaceful morning until at 9:30 a shot rang out through the glass window of a locked front door. A violent criminal armed with semi-automatic rifles, pistols, and ammo let himself into the building. He walked through the halls, eliminating staff members who stood in his path one by one, eventually making his way to 2 first-grade classrooms where he murdered 20 children in cold blood. They were all between the ages of 6 to 7 years old. 10 minutes after he entered the school, he heard the sounds of the police coming and took himself out before they could reach him. It was later discovered that he had even killed his own mother and then used her weapons to commit this act of mass violence. And there was no clear motive ever discovered. This man, this dangerous evil man, was named Adam Lanza. Society obviously condemned Lanza's heartless final act, but they also pathologized him. They started to diagnose him, paint him as a sad, unstable individual who never got the help he so desperately needed, as opposed to the child killer who murdered 26 people with no remorse.
One can only begin to speculate, and I imagine over time, as more information is learned, we'll be able to put together the pieces and have what's called a psychological autopsy of what were the underpinnings for this man, what was his story, and how could something like this unfold. One of the things we do know, although not specific to this perpetrator, 20 is within the age of risk for the development of serious mental disorders.
There was a question that was thrown to Lieutenant Vance. He's the guy who's been obviously holding all of these press conferences, and they were asking about the mental state of the alleged shooter, they still have not done a post-mortem on him, and they're releasing very little information. Is there a connection between these mass killings and people who are mentally ill?
The report gives a glimpse into the life of Adam Lanza, isolated, a loner. He blacked out the windows on his bedroom with dark trash bags. It also talks about his mother's struggle to help her son with multiple mental problems. But Dr. Harold Schwartz, the psychiatrist-in-chief at the Institute of Living, says there are a lot of disorders being listed in the report, but no conclusion.
When someone like Adam Lanza commits a brutal crime that results in the death of over 24 people, the media jumps to mental health as an explanation. He was sick. He didn't get any help. And the thing is, I agree. I agree. The doubt in my mind, there's none, that this man was definitely unwell. And he should have had a village that he felt safe in finding refuge in. But what the hell happens to us when we show signs of mental illness? You don't need to imagine. If you haven't had the unfortunate privilege of knowing his story, meet Jordan Neely. Jordan Neely was a 30-year-old homeless man in New York City who was going through his own mental struggles in 2023. Jordan Neely was riding on the F train when he started asking people for cash and shouting at them, created a little bit of a scene. I ain't gonna lie, he did. And I mean, this is New York City. Anyone who's ever rode on a train there can tell you that there's a higher chance of someone hearing you when you scream rather than when you're silent. So at the sight of Jordan Neely having this non-violent outburst, a passenger named Daniel Penny took it upon himself to handle the situation. And by handling the situation, what I mean is he choked Jordan Neely with his biceps for a whole 2 minutes and 55 seconds. Another person tried to tell Penny that he might be killing him, but he didn't stop. He held on to Jordan's throat even after he shit himself, and a clear sign of body shutting down, it didn't matter. Because Penny didn't let himself go until his body went completely limp like a flag. And by that time, he was already gone. After his death, his family explained that he had been battling with his mental health since his own mother was killed by her boyfriend in 2007. But the media didn't take that into consideration when they discussed Jordan Neely's death. Instead, they found it far more productive, far more accurate to discuss his criminal record. The man dead, you know. The man dead. This man was murdered, who was clearly in a lot of pain and struggling, and he was labeled as an aggressor for his mental health. All the while, no blame was falling on the man that killed him in broad daylight. In fact, plenty of people were branding him as a hero. It sound familiar? Almost like when the guy went to the BLM riots and was carrying a gun and he was a patriot. The same way that they branded Penny as a hero of the situation.
We are on verdict watch, by the way, of Daniel Penny, who's an American hero, which if Daniel Penny goes to jail, there has to be some sort of federal recourse for this. Just a refresher, Daniel Penny was on the subway when this lunatic was harassing other passengers on a subway in New York City. A Good Samaritan, Marine, great man, goes and restrains the lunatic. The lunatic ends up dying for a different reason unrelated to him. Daniel Penny is now facing murder charges for this.
And Penny accepted that title happily, with bells on, stated that he was scared of Neely. He was scared and thought he was going to do harm to someone else on the train.
Daniel Penny, who was found not guilty in the subway chokehold death of Jordan Neely, breaking his silence.
All right, the Marine vet sitting down with Judge Janine on Fox Nation and sharing his side of what went down on that F train in May of 2023. Fox 5's Teresa Priolo here now with what Penny has to say. Teresa.
Yes, Steve and Natasha, perhaps the biggest takeaway from what we've seen of Daniel Penny's sit down, he feared Jordan Neely, who was high on synthetic drugs, would actually harm or kill somebody on the train. And because of that, he said he would step in again if he had to.
The guilt I would have felt if someone did get hurt, if he did do what he was threatening to do, would never be able to live with myself.
You wouldn't be able to live with yourself if he hurt someone. But you have a free and clear conscience when you murdered someone with your own hands. If that doesn't speak volumes. Now let's really sit down and look at this. A white man kills 26 people, mainly children who were as young as 6 years old, and everyone leans on mental health as the explanation. Yes, it was horrible, and it was senseless, but he was just unstable, and nobody got him the help that he needed. On the other hand, a nigger screams on the subway. He's murdered in front of all the passengers, and his mental health is used as a reason as to why it was okay for him to be killed on the spot. They're not even hiding it. It's so painfully plain. We see this all the time, where if we display undesirable behavior, we're dangerous. We're unpredictable. While when white folks, sometimes even at a deadly detriment to the people around them, they're just having a bad day.
I had to learn how to glue a permanent, slightly placid smile on my face. Just because my blank stare, like, let me just take off my glasses real quick. Just me and my blank form, Like I'm daydreaming about washing the dishes and maybe eating them some candy later. When I think I'm in a jovial mood, people are like, "What's wrong with you?"
I was doing a job interview, and it was an AI-powered video job interview. And part of the FAQ on it was basically like, you should treat this like a normal in-person interview. So like, make sure to like make eye contact with the camera, and like your facial expression should, I don't know, reflect the emotions that you're saying. I'm aware that by default, I tend to have like resting face. I tend to have a fairly flat affect. It can come across in things like video. So you can see stuff like that translate into something like an AI-powered job interview, because your affect and your eye contact in autistic people, particularly, it's fairly common for people to be predisposed to not make eye contact during conversation. If I'm trying to talk to someone and make eye contact at the same time, it's very hard. And so that's something that you might get dinged on for a job interview, just because the system is designed for neurotypical standards and it has not accounted for that. And so it assumes that like you might be a worse candidate for that reason.
ADHD, I will completely forget to respond to something or someone, and it's assumed that I'm like maliciously ignoring a person. And it's like, no, I just genuinely forgot. I fell down a rabbit hole, which you tend to do when you're neurodivergent. One thread will lead to another thread and you find yourself lost down this train of thought. And I was talking about it and they were like, oh, you're so obsessed with us. I said, I just like, damn, a bitch can't even like fall into a rabbit hole one time.
Being neurodivergent as a Black person can lead to misunderstandings, prison, or death much more often than it does for white folks. And this reality has understandably shaped how we view and handle mental health in a big way. Okay, all right, so we've established that society treats Black neurodivergence way differently than it does for white folks. I think that we could agree on that. I already knew that in my heart, but seeing all the facts laid out in front of me really makes it crystal clear. We have learned this over and over for generations, and it's evolved the way that we deal with our own neurodivergence in our own community.
In hindsight, I think some of that shyness wasn't necessarily shyness. It was like not totally getting all of the social cues. And so she was actually the one who recommended that I go see a dietitian about having an eating disorder, which I also didn't know. Part of it is an emotional regulation thing. So it's bulimia. Both sides of the coin are ways of being in control and regulating emotions when you feel like you don't necessarily have control. I think in ADHD, that context might look like almost the social thing, also autism, and being like, I don't feel in control of my ability to like engage with other people and I don't know what I'm doing wrong. So like, let me handle those emotions some other way. And in theory, then because I'm not dealing with that, I can be able to get work done or whatever it happens to be.
I was always in the mentally gifted programs. Third grade, I was on a different textbook from everybody else because it was too easy for me. So because of that, anytime I was into something where the autism symptoms were showing or the ADHD, it was like, ain't nothing wrong with that boy. He can do this work. So clearly ain't nothing wrong with him mentally. And I'm like, I'm thinking back on it now, but only being diagnosed like last year. And I'm like, how the did you guys not know I was autistic?
Not seeking mental health services or even believing in it as a concept has practically become ingrained in our culture.
Black men going to therapy. This didn't happen. I'm a first generation Black man going to therapy.
The whole Black people don't go to therapy is much more than just a half-hearted trope, because only 25% of Black Americans will ever seek mental health help, compared to 40% of white Americans.
You may remember Kendrick Lamar's album, which dropped this summer, that also explores this very timely topic. Now, according to researchers, Black men are about half as likely to pursue counseling as their white counterparts when experiencing anxiety or depression.
My Black male clients, this is going to be a spicy part of the conversation because I'm going to keep it a beam. A lot of Black men struggle when it comes to like staying in therapy, and they get mad at me every time I say this, but like the Black male clients that I have that typically stick it out the longest are typically Black men who are comfortable with like masculinity that isn't like hyper masculine. They don't have anything to prove. A lot of men don't get the access to care that they need because they flat out refuse to put the patriarchy down.
Mental health and wellness are taboo topics in Black communities because of its stigmatizing history. This idea that I don't need to go to therapy or ask for help when I'm going through something because I'm Black and I'm strong enough is really harmful and something I used to think is true. There's a pattern of reluctance in Black families when it comes to seeking health support due to many different things, such as socioeconomic factors and harmful stereotypes and tropes around Black identity.
This is a very real thing. And to be honest, I completely get it. After the way that mental health was used against us, the urge to just denounce neurodivergence as a whole and, say there's nothing wrong is understandable. In a world where Black people are criminalized for being neurodivergent, it makes sense why parents wouldn't want their children to get diagnosed with something that could put them in further danger. But that's a danger in itself.
Mental health stigma is what is stopping a lot of us from seeking treatment. Did you know in the African American community, because of racism, socioeconomic status, and environmental factors, we are 20% more likely to be diagnosed with a mental health disorder. Yet, of that 20%, half will actually go get treatment. So if I just said hurt people, that half that never got treatment is the ones who continues that going from generation to generation. That's why we have to look at this as an important issue. The stigma around it. Oftentimes people are afraid to be called crazy. They're afraid that they're going to be called weak. They're afraid, everyone tells me I should be able to do this on my own. Well, let me bust that myth. If you could do it on your own, you would have done it already.
A big part of this whole anti-therapy thing really goes back to the whole stereotype of Black people being strong.
How hard is it to get an honest, vulnerable conversation going in the Black community about mental health and mental illness?
If it's a private conversation, it's not hard at all. Brothers and sisters are always, spilling their hearts out to each other. Publicly, it might be a little bit tougher, just simply because when we wake up in the morning, we got to worry about just surviving, as human beings in this country. We had a term called hardcore, where, you had to walk around, keep your chest out, keep your chin up. You couldn't portray any type of vulnerabilities, any type of weakness, because if you did, you might be fooled out here.
It's pretty clear how this sense of strength has permeated throughout the years when I think about the way that we got here. From the days of the slave trade, we were seen as inhumanely strong. We had to be seen as such to justify the load, metaphorically and literally, that was placed on our backs. The powerful, the puissant Black man trope that permeates popular media, like in Luke Cage, to the primal performances that are extracted from us in adult films. The illustration of dark skin being synonymous with strength is a stereotype that we take as a compliment. I take as flattering. When we're praised for our perceived strength or sexual prowess. But can you blame us? Can you blame us for finding redemption, for finding something salvageable about your existence, after inheriting a history where you're told that your life is expendable? But that very compliment is a cachet filled with the very weapons built against our own humanity, the very weapons that will warrant your own death.
It goes all the way back to tradition and how we were taught, even back to slavery during this Black History Month. We even talked about how we had to be strong back then, right? And so it has permeated throughout cultures and cultures. So even as a therapist, I have to give people permission, Kanja, to say, you can feel again. Because we had, like you mentioned on the break, we were in a war. Our forefather was in a war. So we had to be strong. So we have carried that mentality out.
While the identity of being strong can initially be seen as something good to some people, it can also be extremely dangerous.
The strong Black woman. Trisha, when you hear the term strong Black woman, that's your reaction?
I reject it. I dislike it greatly.
Yeah.
I reject it. I know that it has its roots in slavery, in plantation labor, chattel slavery. It is this stereotype that was placed upon Black women to box us in, to manipulate us, to make us not see ourselves as full divine beings, to push us. A strong Black woman, to me, allows so much time for abuse and manipulation, for not resting, for burning yourself out. Like, we really have to look at what's systematically happening that's making us be so, traumatized by our pace of life. And so the strong Black woman has never been anything I've ever related with. Superwoman, I want rest, I want ease, I need help, help me now. I want help. And so I really like to dismantle and pull back the veil around that term. We shouldn't be claiming it.
And it is that mindset that is passed down to African American girls and women from generation to generation. But there's a problem.
I don't think it's very sustainable at all. And if it is sustainable, if a person survives living this way, we would need to take a really good look at their health.
It's no wonder why Black women have adopted Black girl luxury and soft girl personas as a means of escaping the strong stigma in hopes of being handled with the oven mitts reserved for white women. The problem is that this notion of being unbreakable has created a huge stigma around asking for help as a Black person. I know this far too well.
I ain't gonna lie, I thought depression was fake. For the longest, I was like, dog, that's the biggest excuse I've ever heard. I'm like, I don't know.
What I find disturbing in our community, the African American community, is that we can talk about a thyroid, we can talk about cancer, breast cancer, AIDS even, but we won't deal with the mental. And that's an issue. And it's not even about the skin color or the race. It's about being culturally competent. And the reason why we can't find culturally competent therapists is because at home, in the African American community, we don't talk about mental health. It's a stigma surrounding it. And when you have no one to talk to, what a person usually do is they will try to self-medicate. We're just not allowed to be vulnerable. We have to be strong all the time. This is 400 years of damage, 400 years of trauma that we have not dealt with. And the way we deal with it is be strong. Put on a strong face. Nothing's wrong with you. You don't have mental health. You're not gay. You're not allowed to be human.
I mean, when an entire people is expected to be tough all the time and never ask for help, eventually they're gonna cry. One study found that Black women are more prone than white women to experience things like anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorders, and panic. University of Cambridge also discovered that Black women between the ages of 16 and 34 are more likely to self-harm than white women. This mentality of constant strength without ever needing help is having devastating effects on the Black youth too.
Experts are sounding the alarm over an increased rate of depression and suicide among Black youth.
New data from California's Department of Public Health shows the suicide rate of Black youth has doubled since 2014. And in 2020, 12 out of every 100,000 Black 18 to 24-year-olds died by suicide.
The amount of Black kids taking their own life increased by 54% in 2022, compared to a decrease of 17% in the white youth around that same age. And it's been on the rise for decades now. From 2007 to 2020, these rates among Black children from the age of 10 to 17 rose 144%. This is the cost of leaning into the strong Black generalization and stigmatizing mental health to the point where nobody wants to seek help or even talk about it. And even if it isn't our fault that it got to this point, it's the truth. This thinking about mental health in general is hurting the Black community much more than it's helping. But maybe it seems like the tide might just be turning and there's a space opening for Black people to discuss mental health and actually get relief.
I was going through anxiety, depression, and just identity issues. And I went to the marketplace to, quote, see a therapist, right? Everybody talks about that right now. It should be so simple. But I found that to be incredibly difficult. And then also, my family was going through a laundry list of chronic disease and illness, type 2 diabetes, amputation, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, etc. And I just looked out into the marketplace and I said, who's principally focused on the health and wellness and the trajectory of Black health? Quite frankly, not many people.
Mental health care in the Black community comes from a very personal place.
Many therapists and psychologists such as myself got into this field because we want
people who look like us to know that it's okay to come get help. And those people may feel more comfortable seeing someone who looks like them.
And trust me, I am in full support of everyone getting the help that they need to live a better life, but there's a few things that I noticed when I was making this video that I couldn't get out of my head. Like how it seems a lot of neurodivergent tendencies have been medicalized when they shouldn't have been in the first place. The Cambridge Dictionary defines neurodivergence as, and I quote, having or related to a type of brain that is considered as different from what is usual. I should have probably defined it long ago, but hey. But let me stop you right there real quick, because who decided what usual is? I mean, what does the distinction between neurotypical and neurodivergent really boil down to? In our capitalist society, I'd argue that a great deal of it is based on how much you can offer, how commodifiable you are as a human being. Follow me on this one and give me grace, because I am working this out with you in real time. Please put your pitchforks away. I am just a boy. Now, it's different for everybody, but what are some of the symptoms that can be associated with something like autism? Difficulty understanding social cues and conversational rules, being blunt, strongly preferring one's own routine, feeling overwhelmed in social settings. Interestingly, all of these things oppose the capitalist structure of professionalism, where it's ideal to mask your true feelings and just push through regardless of whatever's bothering you. What about ADHD? You got difficulty paying attention, impulsivity, struggling to finish tasks or follow instructions. Yeah, how the hell did y'all not know I had ADHD? Doesn't it kind of sound like it's considered a problem because the neurodivergent folk aren't performing the way that you want? Sound like a you thing, right? And by you, I mean a capitalist thing, right? How about depression? Losing interest in activities, exhaustion, difficulty completing tasks, struggling to concentrate. Yeah, all of that just seems like it would make it way harder to do things like work and contribute as a quote unquote productive member of society. Not to mention, this whole system is designed to burn us out so much that it could very well be the cause of something like depression. The chicken and the egg, you know?
My thoughts on if we lived in a different society, would ADHD be a quote unquote bad thing has kind of evolved over time. I do think that I probably initially went to the if society didn't suck so much, ADHD wouldn't be weird. People with ADHD would not necessarily be othered in a society that is accommodating. I now tend to be of the opinion of we all have, different lived experiences, and we would still have differing experiences and different challenges as people with ADHD, regardless of the way that society was structured. And you could debate as to whether or not that would be something that you would want to medicate. I think about things like depression in this lens, where it's for some people, living in society is probably a big component of why they're depressed, and some people just have depression and they would be sad no matter what.
And listen, I know mental health truther that's saying this stuff doesn't exist. I'm not trying to say that. The question I'm raising is whether it's possible that behavior and or thinking differently from this arbitrary and capitalist measurement stick is only medicalized so much because neurodivergent limits your commodifiable value.
Because society has socialized us in the way that you can't show me that you're not at your best. Because I'm judging you based off of your performance. And the fear for us is when I no longer can perform, are you questioning my value?
I think this makes a lot of sense when you think about how mental illness is treated most of the time. Instead of improving the quality of life or accepting that people all think differently, they're only focused on what is the most profitable decision.
You can't operate in the way we need you to operate. So here's this synthetic methamphetamine we're going to give you at 25 milligrams. Oh, I'm sorry, what's happening is you can't sleep? Okay, no problem. Here's this Ambien to make you sleep. Oh, is it Ambien in that? Is that making you dehydrated? Cool. We have these salt tablets and this water and this Pedialyte we're going to give you.
If society isn't going to make a buck off of you from being a productive member of society, then they have to get it through another means, right? I don't even want to say they don't cure the thing because it makes more money to like treat it, because this isn't something that needs curing. Like,
right.
They want to claim that there's something that you need because something isn't right with you, and they want to address it in something that you have to pay for, rather than developing a society that embraces the plurality of the way that like we behave.
I work in case management. I work hand in hand with severe autism types. I've had to change adult diapers. I can see the care that these people are given, and a lot of it isn't to make sure they excel in the community, to get them to a point where they can make it somewhere. I mean, that's how it's written, but the aid that they actually give is just a Band-Aid. Here, we're going to let them color at this art program for a few hours a day. Oh, here, we're going to let them watch whatever show you want. We're going to give them a tablet and blah, blah, blah. But we're not going to give them any tools. So you have adults that could have provided to that dollar, but because it may cost a little bit more than they could give back, is not worth it. You have people that can contribute to the economy, but because it's going to take more than they can contribute to get them there, it's not worth it.
Are we prepared to make space, and not just make space for, but honor the humanity of Black women who don't really have much to contribute as far as a product, yet have so much to contribute as far as people?
I think we could both agree that there's far more money in keeping neurodivergent folk as the other, because there needs to be a class that could be oppressed.
Millions in dollars of taxes. Bro, I've seen the budgets. I've had to do these budget write-ups myself. Millions of dollars. And very little of it actually goes into quality of life that actually allows for these people to become better adept at functioning in neurotypical society. You think you're helping these people because they can go to a day program, and you may be helping out their relatives who can have a few days or a few hours of respite. Mm-hmm. But that's what you are. You're a glorified babysitter.
I know a lot of this could be a little humdrum, even though I try to be a little jacuzed when talking about it. However, there actually is more hope now than there ever has been, in my opinion. And a really good sign of that is the fact that neurodivergent folks are finally being included in the conversation of what would be helpful to them. I mean, for instance, my colleague Jordan told me about something really solid, like that gave me a flicker of faith on this topic.
I have a friend, she's also a YouTuber, who is blind, and her name's Lizzie. She's been working with a company called Be My Eyes for a while. They make an app. You basically like walk around with your phone, and there's, I believe, a sighted person that's paired with you. They're also using AI now, though. And that person will describe what is happening around you, such that you can then navigate the world a little bit easier. When they originally talked about how they were going to start incorporating AI into that, like one of my big concerns is immediately like, okay, but like, do you have any visually impaired people involved in this project, or like what? And so it was very cool to see that like she was very, very heavily involved, and still is very, very heavily involved in that project. In the AI space, particularly right now, there are lots of things that people are making because they only talk to like other AI tech bros, and then they launch particularly physical products, and like everyone hates them, and also the quality of the thing they made is bad for reasons that are unclear to me. They end up launching and they like totally bomb because this isn't a real problem that anyone has.
Like Jordan's friend, lots of neurodivergent folks have started getting involved in business and initiatives to make the world a more inclusive place. And I think it might really be slowly changing the overall perception of mental health among Black folks and beyond.
I launched Alchemy Health back in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. And basically we offer mental health video courses led by Black experts and therapists that talk about complex topics that affect our community: generational trauma, being Black in the workplace, so on and so forth. We also make meditations and mindfulness practices that show up on our platform. And then lastly, we go live on our platform to hold space and talk about just things that are happening in real time. We like to say we provide real-time context to cultural happenings.
Today we're here as young change makers to gather together, reflect on what we can do to help influence Black mental health services in the UK.
It's a really important weekend where we're going to be discussing loads about kind of the challenges and problems we're seeing within mental health services, but then really importantly what we can do to change and tackle some of those problems.
We're here to talk about what we've learned and what that means for the future of mental health services for young Black people going forward.
We started Shine on a mission to make navigating your mental health just more inclusive, as you said. And we did that because we didn't see ourselves represented in this idea of wellness.
Don't get me wrong. there still is a lot of work to do when it comes to the structural competency and the mental health field. We need more Black therapists. We need ones that are trained to be culturally competent and see how behaviors and attitudes can be influenced by external forces like infrastructure and healthcare.
A lot of the times we give permission to other people to speak to our own people in the same way. This white woman was saying that I should be working for free as a therapist. And she blamed me for therapy being so expensive. The onus is on Black people often to fix and to be the solution in for systems that we permit that. We permit that amongst ourselves to the point where these people feel comfortable talking to me like that because my own people talk to me the same way.
There are major issues when it comes to the public perception of mental illness in Black versus white folks. And there still is a lot of stigma in the air. But there has been a lot of progress in normalizing open dialogues pertaining to mental health and neurodivergency. We are going to be the driving force behind these crucial changes by educating ourselves on neurodivergence and advocating for more inclusive mental health support systems. But I don't think we're appreciating the gravity in this right here. This moving of molecules of air with these words that at one point would get us ostracized. Make no mistake, this would get us experimented on. If anybody else talked like this, it could get us killed. So I appreciate everyone brave enough to speak about their lived experience today, especially as Black folks. Like my colleague Jordan Howard, who has long discussed how many intersections with a vulnerability that I have not seen thus far. And you can see more of her work on my streaming service, Nebula. I counted how many times I opened everything but Final Cut Pro to finish today's video, and it was more than I care to admit. So thankfully, I opened Nebula and found Jordan's video on how to finish projects you start, ADHD edition. I felt called out in the best way possible because it was right on my homepage exactly when I needed it. And that video sent me down a rabbit hole binging our other videos related to neurodivergence like life after my ADHD diagnosis and why I don't consume productivity content. There's a bevy of thoughtful videos like Jordan's that you won't find anywhere else, like my course on Caribbean storytelling, where I detail the historical process of creating cultural narratives that not only communicate transformative messages, but also transform yourself. Look, not to trauma dump on you, but while I was making this course, my grandfather passed. He had fallen, had a stroke, and ultimately succumbed to his injuries. My team at Nebula encouraged me to postpone the course and take some time to grieve, but I knew that storytelling was my only way through this really dark period in my life. Fast forward to today, and my grandmother, his late wife, just passed. And in a very similar way, from a fall. I couldn't have gotten through this time and been the support that my family needed at that moment had I not found storytelling, because it extracts meaning from the mundane things in your life and renders your life more fulfilled. It's more than me teaching you how to tell stories and how storytelling saved my life, but it's also a collection of my most intimate stories that I've never told anyone else, and I'm not comfortable showing anywhere else but Nebula. You see, Nebula is the home for prestigious videos that won't be anywhere else from your favorite creators like Big Joel and Cat Black. Not only you get our videos early and extended with no ads, but you get exclusive originals like Jet Lag, a travel game show created by the folks from Wendover where Sam, Adam, and Ben, and oftentimes guests like Tom Scott and Michelle Carey, race around the world competing in challenges and battling wits with vignettes of comedy and tension. You too can join the cult. I mean, a community of jet lag enthusiasts that are absolutely well-adjusted people and not chronically online Discord moderators that made a game show their personality. Please don't hurt me, jet lag enjoyers. I have a child. You could gain access to Nebula for as low as $6 a month or $60 per year. But with my code, nebula.tv/foreignman, you get a 40% discount, thus bringing it down to a whopping $36 a year. You could also get Nebula for life for $300, which goes directly to creators making bigger and better projects that you would have a hand in supporting. You can also give the gift that keeps on giving with Nebula gift cards. But most of all, beyond all of that, you get to support us making the works that you love and elevating it to a prestigious piece of art. If you want to support the future filmmakers, documentarians, and storytellers of society, then sign up for Nebula using my code nebula.tv/foreignman.